the boundaries of our own communities and impacting the lives of thousands of people. We're grateful that you've accepted our invitation to join us here this morning, and we very much look forward to your words of wisdom, of inspiration, to sharing with us the insight, perspective, and so much of the Rebbe's approach to life as is relevant, applicable, and accessible to all. Without much further ado, Rabbi Mendel Kalmanson, Shliach and author from London.
Thank you very much. I think it's really precious to be with you this morning. I think every community reacts differently to periods of challenge and disruption. And I think it's so beautiful that your community has chosen to utilize this setback, as others would see it, as a springboard to bring together voices and teachers from around the world in a way that perhaps on a regular year would not have been considered the norm. It's reminiscent of one of the most beautiful anecdotes included in the book, which is that the year the Rebbe suffered the heart attack in Lamed Ches, as you will know, of course, the Rebbe was confined to his room by choice rather than to an actual hospital. The Rebbe said, "This room is my shpital, it's my hospital." It's as a beautiful aside. When the doctors asked, or rather insisted, that the Rebbe remove himself from his room, his office, and be willing to travel to a hospital, the Rebbe very vehemently insisted that he remain. So much so, if I'm not mistaken, there were a few doctors who were fed up, quote unquote, who were quite upset by being dictated to by the patient, in this instance, the Rebbe, that they walked out on the Rebbe and the Rebbe's team. And it's then that they had to bring in, external support from Chicago, Dr. Weiss, and others. So important was it to the Rebbe that he undergo that period of healing in his actual office. And there are a number of explanations given, that the Rebbe himself gave to different doctors about why he was so adamant that he remain in his office, where they created a makeshift hospital. And one of the explanations that he gave was, he said that the walls of this room have absorbed so much of the pain and the aspirations and the anxieties and the dreams of the Jewish people, alluding to the fact that, of course, the Rebbe invited people into that intimate space called Yechidus, space, of course, physical and spiritual, geographical point on earth, but also a spiritual place of spirit, tapping into the most essential core inner constitution of a human being, of a Jew, Yechidah Shebenefesh. And the way I understand the story was, the Rebbe was saying that there are two ways to see healing. One is to see healing from a material standpoint or medical standpoint, where, of course, under all circumstances, the best place for treatment is the hospital. That's where they're all set up. That's where they have the best professionals. They have the ICU unit in case it's necessary, etc., etc. And then there's the spiritual vantage point of healing, which always asks a very different question. What's the root of this particular challenge, medical challenge? Not what are the symptoms, but what is the cause, the root cause? And in the Rebbe's mind, as I'll demonstrate in a moment, every physical manifestation in our life, every physical experience, in our life is a spiritual manifestation, or a manifestation of a spiritual condition or reality. And so from the spiritual vantage point the Rebbe conveyed, there is no better place to receive healing than the very place so deeply intertwined with his life's mission. Because that very room which saw the Rebbe acting in accordance with the mission for which he was put on this earth, which is to be the Nasi Hadar, the Yechidah Shebenefesh of Klal Yisrael, etc., etc., was best captured and embodied in that particular space on this earth. So that was the exhibit A, so to speak, of the Rebbe saying, I'm still needed. This is where I am yet to remain and fulfill the remainder of my mission on this earth. Let's move to a different story quickly, and we'll come back to it, because I think that other story really makes this case. One year during Sukkot, as many of you will know, there were instances where the Rebbe would stand by his sukkah and he would receive Hasidim or anyone who would like to make a bracha over his Daled Minim. And the Rebbe would allow them to make a bracha with the Daled Minim, and many people would pass through. Sometimes this would take hours upon hours. And on one occasion, Rabbi Zalman Jaffe, who was a very well-known and colorful chassid from Manchester, who clearly the Rebbe had a very unique rapport with, came to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said to him, I didn't see your grandson. So first of all, the Rebbe was so attuned to every individual, recognizing which individual's grandchild and which among his grandchildren had or had not shown up. Incidentally, on a separate occasion, the Rebbe once mentioned to a chassid, I noticed that your grandson wasn't wearing glasses on a particular occasion at a Farbrengen. So imagine there were thousands of chassidim at the Farbrengen, and yet the Rebbe managed to notice not just the individual, but something very specific about the individual's appearance that alerted him to a potential concern or change in the individual's well-being. So back to the story with Zalman Jaffe. Zalman said, my grandson, or this particular grandson, is of the camp who prefer not to come see the Rebbe and take away some of the Rebbe's precious time or cause the Rebbe to exert himself in any extra manner. And the Rebbe said, Punkt verkehrt, the Rebbe said. I'm paraphrasing now. The actual quote is very, very powerful, very profound. But I'm paraphrasing. The Rebbe said something like the opposite. Every additional person who comes to see me betters my health because they help make the case to the Eibishter that I'm needed on this earth. I believe that's, to my mind, also a radical story, a real yesod in the way in which we organize ourselves and our worldview and our lifestyle and our behavior and our reactivity, etc., especially in the times in which we find ourselves right now. What the Rebbe was essentially saying, and I think this goes back to the story in the Rebbe's office, that yes, from a material and medical point of view, the hospital, the actual hospital would be the best place to receive healing, etc. However, from a spiritual point of view, because I'm only here on this earth to perform a mission, the best place to receive healing is the very place that will make the case that I'm still needed because of A, the track record, the past, the walls that have absorbed the pain, the suffering, the alleviation of those various stresses from material to spiritual across the spectrum and beyond. And so there's no better place to receive that healing than in this particular room. And I think this story ties in with another story that I included in Positivity Bias because it's absolutely essential in understanding the Rebbe's worldview, and I think is very resonant and relevant in today's time in particular. And this is a story told by Rabbi Simon Jacobson, who his father, Rabbi Gershon Ber Jacobson, as many of you will know, was a very eccentric and unique chassid, and he also had a very special rapport with the Rebbe. And he was also a journalist. And there are many fascinating anecdotes told as far as the Rebbe's relationship with Gershon Ber as he was a journalist, and the Allgemeine Journal in particular, which is the paper that Rabbi Gershon Ber created. By the way, the name Allgemeiner comes from the Rebbe. The Rebbe suggested that he titled the paper Allgemeiner. Allgemein means in general. The Rebbe said that it should be something that everyone can feel is accessible to everyone, which I think is fascinating. And as a very real aside, one of the areas where you find the Rebbe's unique, I would have to say unique and very refreshing spirit of pluralism, to quote, to use a very modern word, is in relation to Gershon Ber and the newspaper. because there were many, many times where Gershon Ber was tempted to censor views that were presented in the paper because they were not in line with the Rebbe's views, they were not in line with the views of halacha or Yiddishkeit, because he featured left-wing, sometimes anti-religious writers as well. And it was the Rebbe himself who suggested that he resist, that he refrain from censoring, because the purpose of a paper is to provide all views, which is, I think, quite an amazing aspect of the Rebbe's Hanhaga and leadership to study in greater detail. And the Mitzvah Shem, I'm working on a project which will highlight all the facets, or many of the facets, I should say, rather. All is impossible, but many of the facets of the Rebbe's leadership, and how they are instructional to each one of us who are leaders in our own right. So just one specific example, there was a case where on the issue of miyuhudi, and we all know that there were very few issues that elicited such a vehement reaction or response on the part of the Rebbe, to the point where the Rebbe very, very often literally screamed from pain, from agmas nefesh, from existential pain about this issue that was existential to the Jewish people and its a national and individual identity, miyuhudi. And on one occasion, the Reb Gershon Ber featured the views of a different rabbi which were totally contrary to the Rebbe's views on miyuhudi. And he says that Friday, as he entered 770, he was very, very, very cautious, because he sensed the writing on the wall. He figured this could either go well or really, really terribly. And as it happens, it went terribly. Within a few short minutes, he was threatened by Hasidim. If he doesn't get out of 770, he would come to physical harm, as only various Kanoim are capable of doing, in all manners of suggestion. And so he ends up back at home very few minutes after he left, and his wife asked him, "What are you doing home so quickly, so soon?" So he says, "Well, I was very strongly encouraged to make my way back home before things got worse, based on the editorial, based on the paper this week." And she asked what it was, and he went back and forth, and she said, "Well, perhaps you've crossed the line. Maybe on this occasion you really did cross the line." By the way, I'm quoting from memory. I may not be saying every detail perfectly, so apologies if I'm not. But this is the gist of the story. And I read it from a transcript of an interview that his wife gave, and I've heard the story told by his children as well. So he actually wrote an apology letter to the Rebbe, and he says, on this occasion, perhaps I went too far, and maybe I should next week I should offer a retraction of that particular viewpoint, because it's so offensive and it's so not in sync with the Rebbe's view and halachic view on the issues. And the Rebbe told him, not at all, the Rebbe said. That individual has to do his. I have to do mine, and you have to do yours. It goes better in Yiddish, but anyhow, that's the basic translation. In other words, the way in which a healthy society functions is where each and every individual is given voice to express their views, and that's the role of a newspaper. On a different occasion, maybe you're familiar with the story. There was a very hostile, secular, left-wing Israeli writer named Natanya Lin Mor. And he had a very close relationship with Rabbi Jacobson. And on one occasion, he spent Rosh Hashanah with Rabbi Jacobson. And on Matzah Yom Tov, he didn't want to go to a Farbrengen during Yom Tov. But Matzah Yom Tov, Rabbi Gershon Ber convinced him to come for a Kashal Bracha. So he comes, and you can see pictures of this. It's very moving. There's actually even footage. Anyway, it's a long and very, very beautiful story. But the essence of the point I want to make is that he came to see the Rebbe, and the Rebbe looked at him and gave him a radiant smile, lifted his hand and says, "This is Natanya Lin Mor, the Natanya Lin Mor." And he was very taken aback, very surprised that the Rebbe would know his name, let alone about his work, because as mentioned, he very often wrote harshly and cynically about the Haredi, what we would call the Haredi Jewish community. And the Rebbe said to him, very, smiling, and, in the Rebbe's beautiful sense of humor, the Rebbe turned to Rabbi Jacobson and said, "I'm sure Rabbi Jacobson won't mind if I tell you the truth, which is that every time I receive the Alkaman, the first piece I read is yours." So very touched and again overwhelmed by the Rebbe's words, he said, "Can I take it? Can I take it from the Rebbe's words that the Rebbe agrees with all of my views?" And then the Rebbe said very poignantly, "Not at all. If I only read the views that I agree with, I would read very little." Again, a very interesting insight, window into that aspect of the Rebbe is what you would call, I guess today, for lack of a better word, open-mindedness, and the Rebbe's celebration of a particular space called the newspaper, and I should add, particular space called the newspaper, where the multiplicity and plurality of views was meant to be encouraged, even if they were diametrically opposed to his own. That's very relevant social commentary on today's world, where, of course, we find the polarization of views, etc., etc. But going back to the story with Reb Gershon Bar Jacobson, Reb Gershon Bar Jacobson had a very real health issue. I don't know if it was I think it may have been a heart attack. I think it was Erev Rosh Hashanah. So he went to, he was brought to the hospital. And either it was Erev Rosh Hashanah or it was between Erev Rosh Hashanah, between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Either way, Erev Yom Kippur, when Simon went to receive lekach from the Rebbe gave him a piece of cake, and then the Rebbe gave him an extra piece and said, "This is for your father." And then the Rebbe said, "I want you to communicate the following to your father. Go tell your father that when he finishes the mission for which he was sent to the hospital, he will then be released." Simon was taken aback at the message, but as a real chassid, he goes to the hospital, he gives his father a piece of cake, and he gives his father the message. I believe it was Motzei Yom Kippur. If not, Motzei Yom Kippur was the day after, that one of the Rebbe's secretaries went to visit Reb Gershon Ber, and the first thing he said to Reb Gershon Ber is, "The Rebbe wants to know if you have finished your mission for which you were sent to the hospital." This is a radical story. I think it sometimes we view these stories as somewhat poetic and charming and very lovely. Elie Wiesel-esque. They could be included in one of his wonderful books about the Hasidic masters. Not at all. These are Yesodis in Emunah. These are actually the most important Yesodis in Emunah, because the way I would put it is that books like Seeds of Wisdom or stories that are live, that are actual, that have real names, real people, real situations, are what you might call the equivalent of Shilas, of Shut, of Shilas Tshuvas, of responsa, right? Because that's where halacha, that's where hashkafa comes to life and to light in real time. And those are the situations that personally, I can speak for myself, have inspired my thinking and my reactions, my interactions and my worldview in real time. Because it's one thing to look at the Sichas Chelek Chavav and to learn about Bitachon. That's where you learn about it in the abstract, from an intellectual and unfortunately sometimes theoretical point of view. But it's by studying the Yechidus and the letters, the Farbrengens and the interactions, the interactional elements, etc., where you find these principles coming to life in practice and in the most unusual and beautiful ways. And that's where you also receive much of the nuance, I should say, that comes with different people, different situations, and so on. So back to the story, what do I think is happening here? Reb Gershon Ber was taken to the hospital. Now, if I was him, and I imagine if any of us were him, what would we be thinking? We'd be thinking, "Oh yeah, brach, this is terrible. This is an absolute setback. This is going to be a period of time which in and of itself is very painful, very disorienting, very disruptive. And then I'm going to lose time from whatever it is I was focused on, from spending time with my family, yomim leiramim, with the Rebbe. There's nothing holier, nothing more elevated, etc., etc." We could probably write a long list of ways in which this experience is negative. And furthermore, we would probably have wanted that this experience not happen or take place in the first instance because of its negative effects on our life. Furthermore, sitting there in the hospital bed, our self-definition would probably be, I am a patient. This guy with the green mask and scrubs is a doctor. The person in the bed to my right and left bed, and then the bed to my left, they are fellow patients. And that's the end of it. I'm here for a period of time. This is not something I would have wanted. Here I am. I have to focus on my physical well-being. listen to the doctors and get out of here as soon as possible. That's the human perspective. That's the medical perspective. Very legitimate, very valid, very natural. And I think that's the go-to place for most people when they're taken to a hospital. And suddenly, like a ray of sunshine that breaks through an overcast, stormy day, he hears something from the ether, from a higher vantage point, from a different realm of insight. The Rebbe communicates to him, when you finish the mission for which you were sent to the hospital, you will be set free. You will return home. Suddenly, this is intentional. This is by design. Suddenly, the principle of Hashgacha Pratis that we talk about ad infinitum as Hasidim comes to life and comes to light in a whole different manner. Because this is usually where the disconnect happens. The disconnect happens is when something, a real physical life situation, circumstance, setback takes place. Suddenly, for some reason, we experience a blind spot. And that blind spot doesn't allow us to manifest the principle of Hashgacha Pratis in the optimal manner. Here the Rebbe is saying to him, you're not a patient, you're a soul. The fellow in the scrubs is not a doctor, he's a soul. The person to your right is not a patient, they're a soul, and the same for the person to your left. And by divine providence, your soul, before descending to this earth, was chosen for a sensitive and very important mission, which is to interact with these individual souls as co-travelers on your life's journey. And Simon said that his father actually was completely transformed from that point onward. He began to literally run around the hospital to whatever extent possible and initiate conversations of soul matters, whatever that may be, with Jews relating to Jewish issues, with non-Jews relating to universal issues, etc. And Simon says that many years later at the Shiva of his father, a particular doctor showed up, one of those very doctors, and he told Simon and the family, I want you to know that the entire Jewish trajectory of my family's journey was altered completely, was transformed for the better as a result of one conversation I had with your father when he was in the hospital as my patient. All because the Rebbe managed to completely transform the way in which Gershon Ber saw that situation. And when the Rebbe sent, I think it was Rabbi Chadikov to Rabbi Jacobson after Yom Kippur, the first question was, have you finished your mission yet? In other words, this isn't a gelechter, this isn't a gleich vertel. This is a yesod and amuna. You are lucky enough to have a Rebbe in your life to remind you of these essential truths in real time so that you don't lose yourself, you don't lose your head, and you don't fall into depression, which is or you don't fall into despair, which again would have been very understandable. And there's a similar story told about Rabbi Darren, the very special shaliach in Connecticut, in Stamford, Connecticut. Him and his wife went through very, 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 very painful and devastating losses in their life. May they only know good news and only know good health and Mitzvah Suras Tevis. But on one occasion, they had a son, I believe, who was in the hospital, and he was really ill, and Rabbi Darren had to spend a lot of time in the hospital for that period. Maybe it was a few weeks' time. And in the duch that he wrote, because he would write a duch every single week, he wrote something like, apologies that I'm not writing about my activities this week, because this week I couldn't do any activities, being that I had to be in this hospital with my son. And the response of the Rebbe is so heartwarming, so powerful. And the Rebbe responded in Yiddish, Ziche, es kann nicht sein as the Eibishter, I'm again paraphrasing to some extent. It cannot be that the Eibishter would cause you to be in the hospital to cause you and your wife agmas nefesh. Chas v'shalom. No, not at all. Instead, the Eibishter sent you to the hospital because you have a particular shlichus to perform to achieve in the hospital. And here too we find, in the case of somebody wasn't a journalist, because in journalism one naturally sees that as a realm outside of shlichus, unless they have the Chabad perspective down pat. But a shaliach, we're talking about someone whose entire life was shlichus. And yet, again, Rabbi Darren did the very natural, and I believe I would have done the same, and many or most would do the same. They would perceive their mivtzayim aspects or their typical shlichus aspects as the shlichus part of their life. And then there was this personal aspect that was absolutely devastating, that created a disruption a detour, so to speak, in his life. And now he was in the hospital dealing with medical issues. Once again, there is this natural view where a person in the hospital is there for the material, for the physical, for the physiological, for the healing. And then there's the shlichus. The Rebbe managed to help him see, today perhaps in psychological language we would call it reframing, was that actually the hospital was an extension of his shlichus. It was a different arena, but nevertheless part of the very same shlichus. And it was here that he would come into contact with people that he would not necessarily come into contact under normal circumstances when wearing his typical glasses of shlichus. And there are many, many, many such stories. They are each so powerful. I have to say that in the Rebbe's own life and experience, and I include an entire chapter of this in Positivity Bias called A Rebbe Revealed, I believe that's what it's called, give me a second, From the Front Lines. A Rebbe Revealed, we find that the Rebbe embodied and practiced this way of thinking in his own personal life during the greatest period of disruption that the Rebbe underwent, if you will, which is, of course, the time when he was on the run from the Nazis, and it was touch and go on many occasions, actually. And it's in that period that you find the Rebbe practicing this understanding, this deep idea of Hashgacha Pratis in real time. There's a lot to be said on this issue, but I believe that this theme is so pertinent to the times in which we live, because if we step back and we ask ourselves, okay, what's going on? Yeah, there are some people who are talking in the rosiest terms about the period we find ourselves. I've seen, I hate to say this, but pundits and even rabbis or spiritual thought leaders talking about the coronavirus as if it's the greatest thing that could ever have happened to society and to humanity. And I really beg to differ. I don't think it's fair, and I don't think it's correct, and I don't think it's in line with our thinking to completely romanticize the current situation and suggest that it's all good. There are people that are absolutely suffering. There are people who are passing, God forbid. It's a really horrific time. It's a magefa, there's no doubt. And so I think we have to maintain this balanced view where we recognize the challenge and we do what the Rebbe did on every occasion where we encountered pain, which was not to justify it, which was not to somehow romanticize it or poeticize it, as some are doing, but instead to scream to the heavens in pain and say, Eibishter, Eibishter, we understand that you have a viewpoint. We understand that you have a purpose for which you brought this pain to the world. But from our vantage point, situtvei, it is painful ad masai, ad masai, ad masai. There's no greater example of this than when a woman in Crown Heights was very tragically murdered, Mrs. Lapine. And I heard from someone who was at the Farbrengen that the Rebbe's hands were literally shaking when he held the bima and he gave the most heart-wrenching talk, demanding of the Eibusher to bring the Gula once and for all. So there's no question that on the one hand, we have to channel the pain that we're experiencing, and we must feel empathy. I mean, to sit back and talk about this as a perfect situation, ideal, oh, thank you, coronavirus, Rahman al-Islam, really and truly. I believe that involves a certain callousness and a lack of sensitivity and empathy. And that's chas v'shalom. The Rebbe once said, and I'm paraphrasing, this is my understanding. I wrote a book called The Time to Heal on this very topic, the Rebbe's response to loss and tragedy. And in the book, I shared a sikha where the Rebbe basically, in the essence of it, says, why is there pain in this world? The reason there's pain in this world is that one human being should open their heart and feel the pain of another human being going through a painful experience. So if a person closes their heart and doesn't feel that pain, they're, in a certain sense, they're acting less than human. They're acting less than the way in which they were created to process that. So we have to have empathy. We have to really and genuinely daven with every fiber of our being for the well-being of every human being. But at the same time, as you know, a Jew is not monolithic. A Jew is multifaceted. We are capable of multitasking emotionally and philosophically. That's what makes a Jew, right? The Alter Rebbe says in Tiny, the quote from the Zohar, on the one side, the spear, on the other side, joy. So At the very same time, the Rebbe always did say that instead of that, at the same time, balancing the great need and urgency of Ad Masai, the Rebbe said we have to ask ourselves not why me, but what now? As in, what can I do in the situation? What is the Eibusher money for me as an individual? Let's leave what the Eibusher is money from society to the mystics, to the prophets, etc. That's way above our pay grade. And I believe there's an element of callousness when we start pontificating about the Eibusher's intentions and designs. But what we can definitely ask is, what now? As in, what does the Eibusher want from me in this particular situation? And there's a beautiful anecdote where the Rebbe told the essence of this to Rabbi Lau, the former chief rabbi of Israel. I believe it was during the Yom Kippur War, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe just after, but I believe it was during. He asked the Rebbe, what will be? And the Rebbe said, Ayid fragt nicht was wird sein, Ayid fragt was kann ich tun. A Jew doesn't ask what will be, but what does this mean to me, or what does this demand of me? So we have to not zoom out, we have to zoom in. Why does the Eibusher want me in my home at this time, surrounded by the people I'm surrounded by? Is this a unique opportunity for me to become gentler, kinder, more loving, more attentive, spend more time with my neshama, in reflection, etc., etc. So that definitely there was a place for. That's where the hashgacha pratis kicks in. Pratis is the key word. Prati, individual. It's not about the world and the cosmos. It's about you and your home and your what you can achieve in this time and how you can grow stronger, wiser, humbler, and better. But anyways, I'm sorry I've been rambling this morning. I actually chose a very sort of formal, structured talk to give to you, but I figured I'd go off script because I want to sort of talk to the times a little bit more. So there's a chapter called Optimizing Turbulence Transition and Transience, which I would highly recommend if you have the time to read. It's actually available on Chabad.org. But of course, as any good author would say, as any author worth their salt would say, you can't compare reading it online to reading it in actual hard copy form. And it's available on Amazon and all other good Jewish bookstores. That's one chapter I would recommend reading, which is particularly pertinent to the times because we are experiencing a period of turbulence, transition, and transience. And there are many, many beautiful stories and anecdotes where the Rebbe applies the thinking of Hashgacha Pratis to turbulence, transience, and transition. And in fact, manages to extract and excavate deep insight in real time about the ways in which we can optimize the times in which we live. And then there's a chapter which is very moving. I would say it's definitely moving to me, which is why I included it. And actually, the publisher wasn't so sure how it belonged in the book, because all of the chapters are really stories about the Rebbe that are instructional for the audience. As you will know from any of the introductions that I write in my books, the books are not about the Rebbe per se. It's not a biography. These books are about you. It's about your biography and how the Rebbe's teaching can influence your life. But I did include an entire chapter about how the Rebbe reacted to turbulence, transition, and transience. And I explained it to the publisher by saying the reason I included it was because if I didn't include it, a person could walk away from the previous chapter saying, well, it's very nice for the Rebbe to say these types of things. This is what we would call perhaps armchair commentary, armchair, spiritual inspiration. But it could not be further from the truth, because the Rebbe's worldview and the Rebbe's behavior were one and the same. And that's what's so unique and refreshing about our Rebbe. There's no disconnect. There's no disconnect whatsoever. It's emes manifest in every way, in every respect. The first letter, the middle letter, the last letter, in all of its configurations and permutations. And so that chapter shows in story after story, from the point of view of the Rebbe's hashkafa, hanhaga, avos Yisrael, how even during the most difficult of times, the Rebbe maintained and sustained the highest levels of Hasidic perspective in thought, word, and deed. Reb Nathanael, tell me what's the story with time?
I think if you're still good to go for about another 20 minutes, that would be wonderful. If you can go till about 9 o'clock your time, but no pressure.
Okay, I'm not sure about 20 minutes, but let's see. Let me see what I could share with you
Sure.
on this particular point. So a letter that I really, first of all, resonated with me very much. And when I read it, I knew I was going to share it. The question was only where and how, which by the way, is my process of writing. Basically, these books are they're the things I far brain with, and they're the things that inform my thinking when I come to an issue or challenge. And very often I look to a story first and then try to find the sikha source, because it's the story that, like I said before, really brings it home. But anyhow, there's a beautiful letter the Rebbe wrote on the third night of Hanukkah, 1944. It's a very revealing letter that the Rebbe wrote in response to a former wartime acquaintance. The Rebbe wrote this, of course, from Brooklyn. And in it, we're given a view into the mind of the Rebbe as he describes the spiritual impact of his experience as a displaced person in Europe during World War II. And I quote, "Your letter awakened memories of the time we were together in Vichy and Nice, under difficult and alien conditions. From the time when a person is uprooted from his habitual environment until he grows accustomed to the demands and conditions of his new place, in this interim, there come to light certain traits of his inner character as they are in their purity, undistorted by the expectations of society. Often, these traits reveal hidden virtues of this person, virtues that may have been hidden even from himself under the layers of manners and social conventions. Fortunate is the person who does not allow these traits to disappear when he subsequently settles down and finds tranquility." I find that to be a very powerful letter, because what the Rebbe is essentially doing is he's saying that the period of trauma and transition and turbulence that we underwent during that wartime experience is not something I look back on and say, if only it hadn't happened. To the contrary, I look back on and say, how can I bring with some of the unique qualities, some of the unique aspects of that time period with me into quote unquote normative day-to-day life, which I think is quite incredible and very pertinent, again, because there's a lot of discussion of how will our world be changed going forward. And I think what the Rebbe is saying is that if you stop and in real time recognize the virtues and the advantages of a particular situation that others might see as negative, and you can then design a plan to maintain or to carry with you those particular features into quote unquote normative day-to-day life. I want to go back for just a moment, because I said before that what makes this, there is a chapter in the book that I didn't include that I would have loved to include and will include in the future, which is it's an unbelievable aspect and event. So of course the event was almost entirely negative to the naked eye. I'm referring to the whole story with the Sfarim, when Sfarim from the Friedrich Rebbe's library went missing, and we all know the details. It's the Hey Tevis story. It's the Hey Tevis story. It's not the story, but it's the Rebbe's reaction in real time that I think is so powerful and very relevant. And it's very much in line with what we discussed earlier, relating to Gershon Ber Jacobson and Rabbi Darren, etc., which is when you perform the mission for which you were sent to the hospital to perform, then the Eibusha will set you free. Just give me a second. I'm going to close the door so the noise level is down. I wish I had prepared I didn't prepare the actual quotes. The Rebbe's words, there's nothing more powerful than the Rebbe's own words. And I, just as an aside, that's one of the aspects of this book and A Time to Heal that guided the format. And actually, there was a professor, there's a woman, a professor, Susan Handelman. She lives in Yerushalayim. She's a fantastic scholar. Maybe you've come across her work, and she had a very close relationship with the Rebbe. When I sent the book to her, she actually helped me with one of the chapters. She's a scholar of Freud, and she helped me. She actually got her PhD, if I'm not mistaken, in Freud. So I think she helped me understand the nuances in Freud's thinking, and that really reflects itself in the chapter about Freud versus Frankl. But anyways, she's a very a wonderful woman, and one of the comments she made when she received the book was, she said, "You've done something different here. Many books either paraphrase completely, for example, the wonderful book by Simon Jakes, Torah, Meaningful Life, where there's literally no quotes from the Rebbe, or they're made up predominantly of quotes from the Rebbe without contextualization." And she said what she found unique about the book was that there was a real sense of, yes, there's commentary, there's framing, and there's context, but you're brought into contact with the Rebbe speaking for himself, and she found that refreshing. And I say that I did that by design, because there were a number of quotes, and one of the people I worked with, one of the editors, actually coming from a more literary background, said, "No, you're quoting way too much. You should be basically paraphrasing in fewer sentences." And we did that on occasion. And then there were times when I went back and I said, no. There is no way we can do justice to what the Rebbe is trying to say in our own words. The Rebbe's words speak 1,000 times better, 1,000,000 times better. I'm not saying it from a mystical point of view, from a chassid point of view. I'm saying literally from a communication point of view. But anyways, so on that occasion, so the Rebbe spoke during that period, and we all know how much Agmas Nefesh the Rebbe had from that time. We all know it. We heard it. We see it. The Rebbe is screaming. It's a bomb. It's a time bomb, etc., etc. So if you want to analyze it from a sort of historical point of view, was there any event that affected the Chabad community in such a disruptive manner like this? I don't think so. Not to my memory, at least. There were global things that were very disruptive. There were things that pertained to the Jewish people. Like I said, there was Miyahudi, which is more of a halachic issue that was, of course, very close to the Rebbe's heart. But if you want to talk about a sort of a personal, personal attack or a personal challenge to the Rebbe, because it really was about the Benkel, as the Rebbe said. That's the way the Rebbe perceived it. It was about the Benkel. Involving the courts, it's a surprise. Again, sometimes we're born into the community, we're born into this, so it's part of our history. We don't stop and analyze it. But this was a very big deal, and it was a very disruptive thing, and it really preoccupied the agenda, if you will, for a period of time. In any event, there's an amazing sikha where the Rebbe basically talks about the Nitzachon in the following way. The Rebbe applies the story of the Alter Rebbe when he was in prison to his own situation. As of course we all know, with the Alter Rebbe, when he was sitting in prison, thought to himself, well, this is a decree against the spreading of Hasidus. We went too far, and he asked his superiors, his spiritual superiors, whether, in fact, this is a sign that he should abort or discontinue the dissemination of Hasidus. And they said, to the contrary, the fact that you will be released represents that the fact that this gezerah, which of course is manifesting a spiritual gezerah, your incarceration, which manifests a spiritual gezerah, with the fact that you will be released demonstrates that Momaila, you're free not only to continue, but to do so in greater, with greater intensity and alacrity. By the way, that's the yesod of everything we've been talking about. For Gershon Ber in the hospital context, for the Alter Rebbe in a prison context. What was the Alter Rebbe's understanding of the situation? Yes, there are reasons that I was accused and put into prison, but what's the cause? Let's not confuse the reason with the cause. The cause is because there is a spiritual gezerah, and that's really the root of this entire situation. And once we address that, everything else falls into place. And the Rebbe in that sikha says that whole way of thinking comes back to Yosef's way of thinking, Yosef in the Torah. How was Yosef able to maintain his integrity, his humanity, his compassion, his sanity, his faith throughout the most turbulent and really tumultuous and traumatic period in his life. How was he able to do so? Because he never subscribed to the human narrative. Instead, he always subscribed and remained attached to the spiritual narrative. He said, yeah, of course I have brothers, and yes, they're upset with me for this reason, that reason, whatever. But that's not why I've been sent down to Mitzrayim. It wasn't you who sent me here, he tells them, but the Eibishter. You were pawns in a greater plan. You were the physical manifestation of a spiritual design. That's how Yosef viewed his situation. That's how the Alter Rebbe viewed his. And the Rebbe then translated into his and says, and that's how we should view this situation. And the Rebbe basically said, this was a Gezerah Milmaila. And now that the Gezerah has passed, what do we need to do? We have to recognize that we have to take the dissemination and the study of these teachings and bring them to an even farther audience than ever before. This, the way I would put it, is the Rebbe saw this as phase 2 of the Gezerah in the times of the Alter Rebbe. The Rebbe didn't say it as much, but that's how I would say it. It's an extension of the same story. And if you learn Chassidus, that's the way to understand the entirety of Torah. Avram went down to Mitzrayim because of a famine. Yeah, that's what historians will say. But is that really why he went down to Mitzrayim? Of course not. He went down to Mitzrayim to extract the Netzutos HaKadoshos that were there and to bring them with him into Kedusha. And the same thing replayed itself later on because there were certain Netzutos that had remained with the Yidden. And that's how the Rebbe explains at length why it was so important that the Yidden leave Mitzrayim b'chush gadol, why they had to clean out Egypt like a fisherman's net, etc. Why was it so integral? Again, because that's the real reason they were sent there. And there's a beautiful sikha that's overlooked, I believe, on the words Vayasa, after Kriyas Yamsuf. Of course, tonight we're going to celebrate Kriyas Yamsuf. Tomorrow we're going to celebrate Kriyas Yamsuf. But there's a pasuk that talks about the aftermath of Kriyas Yamsuf, when the Mitzrayim and all their gold and silver were strewn about on the shores, on the seashore, and the Yidden were basically busy going and collecting all the gold and silver. And then it says Vayasa, that not that they traveled, but Moshe forced them to travel, says Rashi. Why did Moshe have to force them to travel? Because they weren't interested in going. They were very preoccupied with collecting money, collecting gold and silver, which from a cynical point of view reinforces a particular stereotype of Jewish people's obsession with material success and wealth. But of course, the Rebbe, as only the Rebbe could do and would do, provides the most incredible limud zchus. And by the way, I would recommend a chapter in Positivity Bias, which is all about limud zchus. I didn't include this story because I couldn't. There were too many. Incidentally, the whole basis for Positivity Bias was a passion of mine as a bacher, learning the Ketesichas, and I collected over 90 instances of limud zchus throughout Tanakh and Gemara. And basically, the original iteration of the book was going to be focused exclusively on the Rebbe's limud zchus in Torah. But eventually, over the years, it expanded, of course, into how this was a seminal point from which many other expressions flowed. So that's where it went. But that was the original idea as a bacher. And that's, by the way, I'm just sharing with you, that's how I got into writing. How does an old Torah bacher get into writing? It's an exponential leap. It doesn't make sense. I mean, as you know, of course, I'm saying this facetiously. Old Torah manages to teach a person how to speak 3 languages poorly: English, Yiddish, and Hebrew. So I actually, this was something I was passionate about. I started writing and dabbling a little bit, and eventually I started to write more. I actually went and I got a tutor. And I spent many hours with the tutor teaching me the basics of grammar, etc. I read many books. That's how it all happened. So Hashem took me in that path. It wasn't something that I was ever since I was a little child. I decided I want to be a writer. Not at all. Not at all. It was this particular theme that triggered, that activated my personal passion in a very powerful way. This idea of the limud zchus in Torah. So here on this particular occasion, the Rebbe says that this story of Vayasa, Moshe having to compel the Yidden, is merely an extension of this ongoing drama, biblical drama, called the redemption of the sparks. You see, the Yidden recognized that they were taken out of Mitzrayim with their wealth in order to elevate the energetic life force of Mitzrayim, which Mitzrayim, as we'll know, embodies the epitome of Klippa, because it's the place of restriction, limitation, the opposite of free will. which is the opposite of Kedusha and life. And so when more gold and silver showed up on the seashores, the type of gold and silver that had not been accessible to them previously, they said to themselves, oh my gosh, this is our shlichus, this is part of the mission. We have to elevate every last item of the Egyptians of the Mitzrayim. They were so obsessed, not by the material wealth. They didn't need the material wealth at this point. They were so obsessed because they saw this as integral and essential to their shlichus. That's how the Rebbe views that story. It's absolutely mind-blowing. But in any event, this is the Hasidic perspective on Torah, the Hasidic perspective on life, and that's what the Rebbe spoke about on that occasion. That Hey Teves meant Didan Natzach, a spiritual victory, not merely a legal victory. The legal, like the medical, and like the political, etc., are all merely manifestations of a higher vantage point of a spiritual design and plan that comes to fruition on this dimension of existence. And it's for us to peel back the layers of Olam, which comes from Lashon Helem, and to recognize the hidden Aleph of Vayikra, right? The hidden Aleph of Vayikra, which when gone unnoticed, leaves us thinking that the world exists in a manner of Vayikar, Melashon Keri, Melashon Kar, Melashon happenstance, coincidental, which introduces a kaltkite. That's the difference between Bilam and Lahavdil Moshe Rabbeinu. So it's the mission of Moshe Rabbeinu, our Roya Neman, to always provide and maintain and sustain and teach and disseminate and feed and nurture and nourish us with emunah, with bitachon, not in the abstract, but in real time, in real situations. Because this, my dear friends, this is the battlefield. Everything else is the training. Chassidus is the training, and it's there to create those instincts that kick in when we face the challenges themselves. And so we are now facing a real challenge for everyone on some level. And first and foremost, we don't just cry out to the Eibusher, we demand. I saw a beautiful clip of the Rebbe with a different Rebbe. I think it was maybe it was even the former chief rabbi of Israel, where the Rebbe said a Yid has to use chutzpah in his relationship with the Eibusher. The Rebbe spells it out, and they were taken aback. Chutzpah to the Keneged the Eibusher. A Yid has to demand of the Eibusher, I understand you have a plan, but that plan is not acceptable to us on our plane, because from our experience, it is painful, it is concealment, etc. And so really, if you will, I'm basically saying two very opposite things, if you get to the essence of it. But it's not opposites, it's a paradox, and to be a Jew is to be a paradox. Is to contain, as a nice to hafachim, is to contain two very extremes. On the one hand, we must approach the Eibusher with a demand that he bring the Geula Shlema take of Miyad Mamish and remove the pain and the suffering. Bila hamaves lanetzach u'macha Hashem mitnimah ma'al kol panim. And at the very same time, we have to try to decipher the plan. On the one hand, we have to say, we don't want to know the plan. We know there's a plan, but it doesn't matter to us what your plan is. We want it over. It's finished. At the same time, on a personal level, we have to say, but you're talking to me, you're communicating to me, what is your design for me? And so in summation, from prison to hospital to isolation and quarantine, we have the Rebbe's very clear-cut directives and teachings, which if I can sum it up in one sentence is, if you will finish the mission for which you were sent there, the Eibusher will, Amir Hashem, set us all free with the Geula Amitis Hashlema taken from Miyad Mamish.
Rabbi Kalmanson, thank you. That was phenomenal. Much appreciated on behalf of us all. Thank you for joining us and taking your time out of your morning.
It's a real pleasure and a privilege. Thank you for the opportunity. Wishing you all continued success and a wonderful Yom Tif.